Do you ever feel like there's more happening behind the scenes than meets the eye? That powerful forces are playing a game of deception while the rest of us are left in the dark? Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, has pulled back the curtain on a truth so explosive it has left West African leaders scrambling and the French government reeling. This revelation isn't just a story about politics, it's about the fight for dignity, freedom, and Africa's future. Chapter 1: The Deceptive Expulsion of French Troops. Recently, there's been a wave of announcements from African nations demanding the expulsion of French troops. Countries like Chad, Senegal, and Ivory Coast have followed this trend. But the truth behind these headlines is far more sinister than it appears. According to Traoré, these supposed expulsions are nothing more than a calculated move by France to reposition its power in Africa. Let's be clear, Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger have genuinely broken ties with France. They've removed military bases, rejected colonial agreements, and are forging their own paths. But what about the others? In places like Ivory Coast, the so-called withdrawals are an illusion, orchestrated by France to maintain control through indirect means. This is a strategy rooted in the British playbook of proxy rule, where puppet governments are left to manage day-to-day affairs while the real power remains in foreign hands. Here's the question: if these governments are truly committed to independence, why are they still clinging to colonial-era agreements that exploit their resources and stifle their potential? Chapter 2: The Case of Ivory Coast. Among the nations making headlines, Ivory Coast stands out. Its government claims to have expelled French forces, but Captain Traoré has called their bluff. He argues that kicking out troops is meaningless if the country doesn't sever deeper ties. For example, Ivory Coast remains economically bound to France through the CFA franc, a colonial-era currency system that ensures financial dependency. This currency was established in 1945 under General Charles de Gaulle as a way to stabilize France's economy after World War II. Its design is rooted in exploitation, allowing France to control African economies while siphoning wealth back to Europe. To this day, reserves of CFA franc nations are held in the French treasury, limiting their financial independence. How can any country claim sovereignty while its financial system is in the hands of another? Traoré challenges leaders like those in Ivory Coast to go further. True independence means reclaiming control over resources like cocoa, gold, and oil, industries that remain dominated by foreign corporations. It means taking back their financial autonomy and printing their own currency. Without these steps, he argues, African nations will remain trapped in a cycle of exploitation. Chapter 3: France's Strategy of Humiliation and Adaptation. The withdrawal of French troops from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger marked a major shift in the region. These nations not only rejected France's military presence, but also exposed its long-standing neo-colonial agenda. France, humiliated and struggling to maintain its influence, quickly changed tactics. Rather than fight to maintain its military bases, it began a calculated campaign of strategic retreat. Let's break this down. France is pretending to honor the demands of African nations by withdrawing troops. But this is no surrender. Instead, it's a pivot to a new form of control. By focusing on indirect rule and economic dominance, France hopes to retain its influence without the public outcry that comes with military occupations. Here's the irony. While Emmanuel Macron criticizes African leaders for their ingratitude, his government clings to the very structures that have drained Africa for decades. The CFA franc is one example, but there's more. French corporations dominate industries like agriculture and mining, ensuring that profits flow back to Europe while local populations see little benefit. Chapter 4: The Legacy of Betrayal. Macron's narrative about France being a benefactor to Africa is a textbook case of historical manipulation. He claimed that African nations wouldn't exist as sovereign states without French military intervention. But this is a deliberate distortion of history. Take World War II, for example. Hundreds of thousands of African soldiers fought for France, sacrificing their lives in battles that were not their own. Yet, when the war ended, they were met with betrayal. In 1944, African soldiers in the French army demanded their promised wages. Instead of honoring these promises, France responded with violence, the Traoré massacre, where dozens of Senegalese soldiers were killed for daring to demand what they were owed, is a haunting reminder of France's hypocrisy. And it didn't end there. In the post-war period, France implemented the CFA franc, ensuring that African economies would remain tied to French interests. This monetary system, often compared to policies used by Nazi Germany during its occupation of France, represents one of the clearest examples of neo-colonialism in action. Traoré's response to Macron's claims has been scathing. He reminded the French president that it was African soldiers who fought and bled for France's freedom. "It is thanks to our ancestors that there is France," he declared, turning Macron's narrative on its head. Chapter 5. The Fight for Mental and Economic Liberation. Traoré's message goes beyond military independence. He has called for a complete decolonization of African mindsets. For centuries, colonial powers instilled a narrative of dependency, teaching Africans that they couldn't succeed without European guidance. Breaking free from this mentality is just as important as removing foreign troops. But Traoré isn't stopping at words. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso has taken steps to build an independent army, one that isn't reliant on foreign advisors. He's pushing for the nationalization of industries and the establishment of financial systems that benefit the people rather than foreign powers. In contrast, countries like Ivory Coast have yet to take these bold steps. Their economies remain deeply tied to France, and their leaders seem unwilling to break the chains of dependency. Traoré's challenge to them is clear: if you truly want independence, prove it. Don't just remove foreign troops, dismantle the entire system that keeps you under foreign control. Chapter 6. France's role in destabilizing Africa. One of the most damning aspects of France's involvement in Africa is its role in creating the very instability it claims to fight. Take Libya, for example. France played a key role in the NATO-led intervention that overthrew Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. This action unleashed chaos across North Africa, leading to the proliferation of weapons and the rise of terrorism in the Sahel region. The instability in Mali, which France used to justify its military presence, is a direct consequence of its actions in Libya. By positioning itself as a savior, France created a narrative that justified its interventions while obscuring its role in causing the problem in the first place. Traoré has been vocal about this hypocrisy. He pointed out that Mali's request for French aerial support was manipulated into a justification for ground troop deployment. This pattern of exploitation and deception is at the heart of Traoré's critique of neo-colonial powers. Chapter 7. Why Africa holds the key. Africa has long been a land of immense potential, brimming with natural resources, a young and energetic population, and increasingly promising economic reforms. Today, more than ever, the continent is at the center of a tug-of-war for influence as Western countries, alongside emerging powers like China, Russia, India, and Saudi Arabia, compete for access to its resources and markets. What does this mean for Africa's future? Foreign direct investment in Africa has seen a remarkable upswing in recent years. In 2021, UN figures revealed that investments reached a record-breaking $83 billion, more than double the amount from 2020. This growth is tied to Africa's expanding appeal in sectors such as agriculture, energy, and rare earth minerals, all of which are experiencing rapid development. This surge is no accident. Africa's rich deposits of critical materials like cobalt, nickel, and rare earths, crucial for producing green technologies, have captured global attention. As the world transitions to renewable energy, these resources are becoming as valuable as oil once was. Western nations, particularly the United States and European Union countries, are keen to tap into this wealth to support their own green energy transitions. But they aren't alone. China has established itself as Africa's largest single external player, funding infrastructure projects and securing lucrative mining contracts across the continent. Russia, too, has been increasing its presence. often leveraging military and diplomatic ties to gain influence. Meanwhile, countries like India and Saudi Arabia have begun asserting themselves, recognizing Africa's potential as a growing trade partner. Chapter 8. Why the West can't look away. Despite losing ground to new players, Western nations remain deeply involved in Africa. Investment flows from the West continue, particularly in agriculture, energy, and oil and gas exploration. In Namibia, for example, the European Union and Germany are heavily backing one of Africa's largest green hydrogen projects. This reflects a clear strategy, diversifying energy sources to reduce reliance on Russian gas in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. Still, there's a contradiction in Western approaches. While they tout green policies, their investments in oil and gas projects on the continent are expanding. This inconsistency underscores a hard truth. Africa's role in global energy is growing, but at times it appears to be a means for others to solve their own problems rather than fostering mutual benefits. Chapter 9. The colonial shadow in investment. Western investments in Africa have historically been tainted by exploitation and inequality. A recent report by the Center for International Private Enterprise criticized these investments for prioritizing resource extraction without adequate environmental safeguards and perpetuating economic dependence on foreign powers. The report described the ongoing cycle where African nations provide raw materials while the profits and benefits flow out of the continent. Take, for instance, the infrastructure projects backed by Western loans. These often come with strings attached, such as steep interest rates that make it difficult for African nations to repay. This creates a cycle of debt dependency, which only strengthens the West's upper hand in negotiations. High risk is frequently cited as the justification for these steep costs, but it's a justification that puts African economies at a perpetual disadvantage. Yet this pattern isn't exclusive to the West. China has also faced similar criticism for its investments in Africa. With accusations of debt trap diplomacy, African nations have become adept at balancing these external forces. But the reality is that the current systems leave little room for equal partnerships. Chapter 10. The hunger for resources. Africa's vast natural resources are undoubtedly a major driver of investment interest. Minerals, oil, and agricultural products form the backbone of many African economies. And the appetite for these resources has only grown stronger in the 21st century. For instance, the demand for cobalt, a key component in batteries for electric vehicles, has led to fierce competition in African mining sectors. But as the scramble for resources intensifies, African leaders face the challenge of ensuring that these investments actually benefit their citizens. Too often, the profits from resource extraction are funneled into the coffers of multinational corporations rather than supporting local communities. This is where strong governance becomes critical. As Adjoa Ajetum, CEO of the EBII Group, notes, African governments must implement policies that ensure foreign investments create meaningful opportunities for their people, not just extract wealth. Chapter 11. The shift toward partnerships. There is a noticeable shift in how investments are framed today. Western governments, particularly the United States, have begun emphasizing partnerships over traditional aid models. This change is driven by both necessity and competition, with China and Russia offering no strings attached investment deals. The West has had to rethink its approach. This pivot toward partnerships has led to the establishment of specialized government departments aimed at fostering collaboration with Africa. But are these partnerships truly equal? Many African leaders and experts argue that, despite the rhetoric, the old power dynamics persist. Investments may be framed as mutually beneficial, but the terms of these agreements often leave Africa on the losing side. Chapter 12. Africa's growing leverage. Despite these challenges, Africa's leverage on the global stage is growing. The competition between the West, China, and other players has given African nations more options than ever before. No longer beholden to a single power, they can negotiate better deals and push back against exploitative practices. This newfound leverage is particularly evident in the energy sector. The European Union's support for Namibia's green hydrogen project is just one example of how Africa is becoming a key player in the global energy transition. As countries look to diversify their energy sources, Africa's resources and strategic location make it an indispensable partner. Still, this leverage must be carefully managed. Political stability, infrastructure development, and economic reforms are crucial for maintaining Africa's appeal as an investment destination. Without these, the risks of doing business in Africa, often exaggerated but not entirely unfounded, could deter potential investors. Chapter 13. Breaking free from dependency. One of the most significant challenges facing African nations is breaking free from economic dependency. For decades, foreign investments have been structured in ways that reinforce this dependency, keeping Africa reliant on external powers for capital, technology, and expertise. But the narrative is slowly changing. Leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso are advocating for complete economic independence, pushing for policies that prioritize local development over foreign interests. This includes nationalizing key industries, rejecting exploitative agreements, and building financial systems that serve the needs of the people rather than foreign creditors. These moves are part of a broader push for mental and economic liberation, a rejection of the colonial mindset that has long framed Africa as a continent in need of saving. By taking control of their resources and asserting their sovereignty, African nations are beginning to chart their own course. The path to true independence is far from easy. It requires bold leadership, strategic planning, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. African governments must ensure that foreign investments align with their long-term development goals rather than simply providing short-term gains for foreign powers. Chapter 14. True Independence. The revelations and actions of Captain Ibrahim Traoré have sparked a movement across Africa. He has shown that true independence isn't just about removing foreign troops, it's about reclaiming economic and political autonomy. It's about rejecting the narratives that have been imposed by colonial powers and embracing Africa's own potential. For nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the path forward is clear. They are breaking colonial-era agreements, nationalizing industries, and building independent financial systems. But for others, like Ivory Coast, the challenge remains. Will they follow the path of true liberation, or will they continue to play into the hands of foreign powers? This isn't just a story about leaders and governments. It's about the people of Africa, farmers, workers, students, and entrepreneurs who deserve a future free from exploitation. It's about creating a continent where resources are used to benefit the people, not to enrich foreign corporations. What do you think about these revelations? Should African nations take bolder steps toward true independence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.